Hi, and thanks for joining us today. My name is JoAnn, and I'm an educator with Discovery Hall programs here at the Dauphin Island Sea Lab. And today we want to focus this segment on carnivorous plants. So you guys may be familiar with a certain charismatic carnivorous plant, the Venus Flytrap. So we've maybe seen these before, whether in real life or in a cartoon, these plants that are able to trap insects and actually eat them. Well, here locally we have awesome examples of carnivorous plants, our pitcher plants. And so here in our little bog at the Sea Lab, we have a couple of different species of these pitcher plants. These pitchers that you see here, you can see kind of where they get their name. The plant itself, these are modified leaves which form this tall tubular pitcher, like a tea pitcher or water pitcher. And the pitcher itself is what attracts and traps the insects that these plants are eating. So the one that you just saw there, that's a pale pitcher plant, and that's a very common species that we have along the Gulf Coast here. So in our Gulf Coastal Plain, Alabama, Mississippi, both, we have about 8 or so different species of pitcher plants. They're all belonging to the same genus, and they actually hybridize. So two different species can actually make new individuals, and so that's why it gets a little bit difficult to say how many distinct species there are. But here in our bog, we have 2 different species of these pitchers. And like I was saying, they have these modified leaves. They do have a little kind of a cap or a lid to them. We call that an operculum. And if you were to look down inside the tube, you would see down at the base is actually a liquid, and that liquid has enzymes and bacteria to digest insects. So that's actually very similar to what's happening with our digestion, right? When we eat food, putting food in our mouth, and right away there are enzymes and bacteria in our mouths that start digesting that food. Well, this plant does the same thing. There are small insects that will actually be attracted to the bright colors of these plants. They have an aroma, that a smell that attracts insects, and then actually along the lip here, that can be quite slippery, and that will cause insects to fall into the pitcher or into the tube, and then they're digested in those juices down in the bottom. So the pitcher plants work that way. It's sort of different from the flytrap that actually closes on the insects. We have another group of carnivorous plants here in our bog. If you look closely, a much smaller plant, but another carnivorous one. This is a sundew. And you can probably see on that plant there are little hairs. And at the ends of those hairs are little droplets of a sticky fluid. And those are able to trap small insects. So I can actually see some little ants running around in our bog here. There will be moths that will be attracted to the pitchers, lots of different insects. They're actually, if we look here, we have some new flowers coming up for the white top pitcher. This is a really brilliant, just a really interesting looking pitcher. Unfortunately, the pitchers of this plant haven't come up yet. This is what's left over from last year. The flowers emerge first, and so these are their flowers. They will start to open and eventually look like these others that you see here. And the flower of the pitcher plant, I'm going to just swing around you, are odd at first when you look at them, because they're actually an upside down flower. So they have all the same parts that you would expect of another flowering plant. If you've learned some of that anatomy before, the petals, the stigma, the style, the ovary, the sepals, they have all of those structures. They're just oriented upside down. Bees are actually the main pollinator of these plants, and they will crawl inside that flower, getting nectar and picking up the pollen that falls onto that cup-shaped style, so they can catch the pollen there and even on their backs and then when they fly to another plant, they can transfer that pollen and fertilize that flower. So even though they look quite odd, it's just that they're upside down and have that kind of cap structure to them. So,
Rihanna, who's 6,
yeah.
she asked, what is the name of the little sticky droplets that attract the insects? So is there a name for exactly what those droplets are?
So I think they probably do have a very hard to pronounce scientific name, but we just call them droplets.
If we
maybe
were to...
a mucilage. I'm not sure of the exact name, but that is a great question.
So if we were to touch that sticky substance, would it do anything to us?
It would not. So it's really mainly geared towards digesting those very small insects. And actually, what I have here are some of the old pictures from last year, and you can see inside this one, and I'm actually going to shake the little bits out into this petri dish here. These are the exoskeletons of the insects that they ate last year. So the exoskeletons are not easily digested, and so we can actually see those left over inside the plant.
Wow.
There is actually a moth that has a symbiotic relationship with the pitcher plants. We call it a pitcher plant moth or Exira, and they will actually live inside the pitchers. They are adapted for being able to survive and crawl out of the pitcher, and they actually reproduce inside that pitcher. And I got to see some just the other day. So I don't think we have any in ours. They're very small, but if you look down inside that picture right there, you can see those Exira moths. I took these at the Splinter Hill bog, just north of Mobile. It's actually in Baldwin County, really close to I-65. And that pitcher plant bog is very expansive. It's a beautiful bog, and you can see those moths inside the pitchers there. What we do have living inside of some of our pitchers are little tree frogs. And so if we look down inside this one, you can maybe see, he's going to crawl up for us a little bit, and it may make it easier for us to see him. Come on, little frog.
Here he is.
So the little tree frogs will hang out in these pitchers because it's a nice damp place for them. Their skin has to stay damp, and also they probably have a pretty good supply of insects to eat. Like I said, there are all sorts of ants and other little insects that crawl around in our bog. Yesterday, one of my coworkers actually saw an anole scooting around in here. So lots of animals actually do use pitcher plant bog habitat for their homes. Now that pitcher plant bog habitat that I just kind of mentioned, this is a unique habitat. It's very rare. We do have, some stretches of this habitat, like I said, in Mississippi and Alabama, but scientists think that about 97% of this habitat for these pitchers has been lost. So they're actually living in a fire-dependent habitat, and so these are pine savannas or seepage bogs, wet savannas, and they rely on fire to come through and clear out shrubs and trees because they really need full sun. They really rely on that full sun.
So JoAnn, we have a couple of questions.
Yes.
First off, big shout out from Tanya in Madison, Alabama. She says hey to us. Ethan, who's in 7th grade, asks, how does it breed? How do the plants breed?
So they actually grow on a rhizome. So you'll see them in clusters like these, and the plants will grow along that rhizome. But then there is seed dispersal as well. So with the flower, they're producing seeds, and oftentimes those seeds get carried away by rain or floodwaters. So the habitat, like I was saying, where these pitchers grow, is a wetland, right? We focus on wetlands a lot down here because we have our wonderful coastal marshes, which are wetlands. But these are just a little bit further inland and not as wet as a salt marsh. But so they do occasionally flood, but really most of the water is under the ground. So one of the other really fun animals that lives, and I'll grab a picture, that lives in pitcher plant bogs. Does anybody know what that is?
Well, while they try to figure out what it is, quick question from Poppy, who's 5. Wants to know if there's an advantage for a plant to be carnivorous over non-carnivorous.
Yes, so the carnivorous nature of these plants is an adaptation that they have. So the environment that they live in, these bogs, the acidity, the soil is quite acidic. So the pH is pretty low, lower than the soil maybe in your yard or in a garden. So around 4 or so pH. And because the acidity is so low, the nutrients that we find in our soils aren't available to these plants. So they're lacking nutrients, right? We know plants need water, sunlight, and nutrients that they're getting out of the soil. And so it's an adaptation that they have, that they've evolved living in these harsh conditions to eat insects to get those extra nutrients that they need.
And Rihanna adds, is there any specific insect they would not eat? So is there anything that pitcher plants don't like?
So as things get larger, they would have a harder time digesting, but I have heard or seen images of carcasses of even small frogs inside the pitcher plants.
All right, so let's get back to your animal because we didn't tell him what it was.
So that animal is a crayfish or crawfish or crawdad, whatever you happen to call it at your house. And I grew up calling them crawdads and catching them in the creeks. But these pitcher plant bogs actually have crayfish living in them. They will burrow down. They form these tunnels or tubes to get down to where it's wet. And there are some that live in the pitcher plant bogs of Mississippi and Alabama that live nowhere else. So like I was saying, these bog habitats are very rare, which also means that the plants and animals that live in them are quite rare. The protection for these plants and animals varies from one place to another, from state to state. But these are really fragile habitats. Like I said, they're fire dependent. But one of the other things, so fire suppression, people not allowing wildfires to happen, has caused a loss of this habitat. But also they are common for flower arrangements. So people will go out and harvest the pitchers, and that causes damage. But then there is even, you can believe it, a black market for pitcher plants. So illegal harvesting of pitcher plants is a problem as well.
First off, congratulations to everyone who got that right. We had several that were correct with it.
Wonderful.
Mia, who's 7, how does the moth live in there without getting digested?
So they tend to stay in the upper part of that pitcher, and they do just have uniquely adapted feet, and they stay head up, and they can crawl out. The larvae, their babies, will actually chew their way out of the pitcher, so they never fall all the way to the bottom and get digested.
And one more.
Yes.
Ava, who's 12, asks, how do plants digest food if they don't have organs?
So, like I said, it's the enzymes and those bacteria that are breaking it down. So it's a pretty simple form of digestion. It's not quite as complex as our own digestion.
All right. So what were you going to show us next?
So this is another wetland plant that we see along around in Alabama. You've maybe been in a swamp before and seen a cypress tree. So this is a pond cypress. And you can tell the difference between a pond cypress and a bald cypress by looking at the kind of needle-like leaves. On a pond cypress, they point up like this, and on a bald cypress, they point down. But again, this is a plant that is uniquely adapted for living in a wetland. Like I said, if you've ever been in a swamp, they produce funny roots that come up out of the ground. They're called pneumatophores or knees, and so that's just an adaptation that they have. And then this is one that maybe some parents will be familiar with. This is a plant called St. John's wort. So there are actually several worts that live in bogs. St. John's wort is not carnivorous, but bladderworts are, also butterworts. That word wort, dates back a long time ago and was often given to plants that had medicinal value. And St. John's wort is taken medicinally. There's another plant over here common in our bogs, the white top sedge. It looks kind of like a white star. You can see that one there. And then this one here, it's lost some of its petals. It kind of looks like a sunflower, but it's actually called sneezeweed. Sneezeweed. Apparently, if you crush it up and inhale it, it will cause you to sneeze. I think we have just a couple more over here that I wanted to show off. This one is kind of impressive. If you look at the base, it has this large, impressive kind of star-like base, and then sends up this big, tall flower spike. It's called yellow colic root. And then another one that are one of my favorites, these hat pins, because they look like a lady's hat pin. When wearing hats was very fashionable, women would secure their hats with these long, sturdy pins. These are also called hard heads, which some of you guys at home may have been called before.
Owen, who's 13, what do the little hoods on the plants do?
So they will get filled with rainwater, and part of that is to kind of shield it from rainwater, as far as I know. Again, I'm not a botanist, but I believe that that's their main function.
Charlotte, who's 8,
and just attraction too. Sorry, the coloration and all of that is to help attract insects.
Charlotte, who's 8, asks, what is a bog?
So a bog, like I was saying, a bog, a wet, low pH environment. So like a peat bog. Our bogs tend to be kind of a sandy soil, but others you may have heard of with the peat bogs.
And Nora is talking back on the plants, the colic one?
Colic root,
Why do they have the star on the bottom?
So that is just the shape of their leaves. I'm not sure that it serves a function necessarily, but it certainly does make for kind of a striking plant.
And then to wrap up, going back to the science and the education that y'all work here with Discovery Hall programs, K through 12 and professional development, this environment is a wetland.
Yes, it is a wetland, and it's a pretty rare habitat, and so it serves a lot of important functions and provides that habitat. There are actually, so in addition to the carnivorous plants, there are over 100 different species of plants that you can find in these bogs, and so some of our local reserves have done a really great job of protecting these habitats so that they're here for future generations. And so we like to talk about these critical habitats that we have that are kind of unique to our area. But you can actually find pitcher plants in other parts of the world. Like I said, we have about 8 or so species here, but then total I think there are 20 or so different in the US. And then if you go to South America, they have their own set of pitcher plants. You maybe even have seen at a garden store or something another kind of pitcher plant. They'll put them in hanging baskets, and those are just from other parts in the world. But yeah, we highlight these because they are a local habitat. They're a critical, definitely endangered habitat, and one that we can highlight here locally.
Carrie asks, and we'll finish up with Carrie after Nora wanted to make sure you knew you're awesome.
Oh, thanks.
But Carrie asks, is there a way to create this specific mini box? So is there a way to create something like this at home?
You can. It's a matter of getting a hold of the plants and getting a hold of the plants in a responsible manner. So I know here locally, some of our garden clubs and different places will sell pitcher plants that they have raised, in some responsible manner, that I do believe are local species. So the hardest part really is getting your hands on the plants themselves, but then the soil pH and really the drainage, making sure it stays moist.
And I'll pull back so that we can see. It kind of sits up. that we have here for our education.
And some of you that have been around the Sea Lab, this actually used to sit over at our aquarium at the estuarium, and was moved here a number of years ago. They used to burn it over at the estuarium, right? Those fire maintained habitats like this. It does them a lot of good to be burned, but we're pretty close to the building here, and
We don't want to do that. We don't want to do that. All right, so JoAnn, let's finish off by seeing if our frog is still hanging out, and we'll say goodbye and thank you to everybody. And tomorrow we're talking about marine worms. Is he in there?
He's still in there.
He's still in there. He's perfectly happy.
Hello, tree frog.
All right. Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us this morning, and we'll have this up for y'all to watch as many times as you like. And tomorrow we talk marine worms and sediment and all that fun stuff.